Today is Monday, February 2nd, 2009. My name is Mark Depew. I'm the volunteer with the Abraham Lincoln Presidential Library, and we're here today with Orion Samuelson. Good morning, Orion.
Good morning.
This is quite an honor for me. This is part of our Oral History of Illinois Agriculture project that we are partnering with the Illinois State Museum. And from the beginning, from the inception of our plan, we've been looking forward to talk to the voice of agriculture in the Midwest. And probably, I would venture to say, Orion, that you're the most recognizable voice of agriculture in the United States.
Well, I've been doing it so long. You know, I've been at this business for 56 years. So I guess over that time period, a lot of people dialing the dial come across me. So.
And we are coming up to your 50th anniversary with WGN Radio here in Chicago.
Well, God willing and the boss willing, I will make 50 years in September of 2010. My wife has given me permission to shoot for that half-century mark because there has never been anyone else on this station that's been on the air for 50 years.
Well, and that's some good company beekeeping for the names that have been on this station over the many years.
Oh, the people that I've had the pleasure of working with, from Wally Phillips to Franklin McCormick to Harry Carey and Jack Brickhouse and to Uncle Bobby and Spike Odell, and just, you know, it's a history library of broadcasters as far as I'm concerned. And when I write the book, which I'm going to do, I have told all of my friends that in all of my years of working here, there are just two people I did not enjoy working with, but you'll have to read the book to find out who they are.
Well, maybe these interviews will help you write that book to a certain extent.
You know, I'm hoping so, because I have been talking about doing it for the last 10 years, if nothing else, just for my two grandchildren, so they'll have some sense of what their grandfather did. But because of what I've witnessed, I think I could probably share some highlights and some lowlights that our farmers and ranchers have faced over the years. And so I have the title, I'm going to call it the Manure Tour, you know, life with a agricultural broadcaster. And but sitting down to do it, because I'm not a writer. I do all my writing with my mouth. And so that's what you're doing here. You're letting me use my mouth, and maybe the audio can be used by a writer to put it together.
Well, you'll have the added benefit of actually having transcripts of what we've talked about here as well.
I appreciate that. It's an honor for me, incidentally, to do this.
Well, thank you very much. I think I also should mention where we're at, because we're obviously in the WGN studios. This is your office in those studios, but we're in the Tribune Tower, which brings an awful lot of history just in itself, does it not?
A tremendous amount of history, historical landmark history, the lobby of this Tribune Tower, and I think the cornerstone was laid in 1925. And the lobby is one of those national historic landmarks that cannot be altered, regardless of what we do to the rest of the building. It must remain the same. And Colonel McCormick, who was the ultra-conservative publisher of the Chicago Tribune, has had carved into the walls the various press sayings that go back to Voltaire and you know, to deep history. Plus the fact it's fun to watch tourists who come to Chicago, because they stand outside the tower and they look at the rocks or the stones that have come from the White House and from Buckingham Palace and from the pyramids, that the colonel said we ought to have those here in the walls of the building, and they are here.
Well, he was quite a character himself.
You know, I had the opportunity of meeting him, but when I was working at a radio station in Appleton, Wisconsin, back in 1954, we were a mutual station, and WGN at that time was part of the Mutual Radio Network and originated programs like Tom Mix, the Monday through Friday Western serial, and Saturday night did the Saturday Night Theater of the Air, which was performed in the building adjacent to the tower with a live audience, a live orchestra, and they would do operettas on Saturday night. And working at the station in Appleton, Wisconsin, I would hear this because I was on duty on Saturday nights. And then at the end of the program, at about 9:55, the colonel would come on and deliver his weekly sermon, according to Colonel McCormick. And so I sat listening to those sermons, never thinking that I'd someday be working in the same studios that the Colonel was in.
I must tell you that I've got a military background. My buddies in the military can never understand why in the world the 1st Infantry Division Museum is in Chicago. Actually, west in the suburbs of Chicago.
Right, yeah.
And it's because McCormick, Colonel McCormick, was in the 1st Division, was in the Big Red One during the First World War, and by God, he had a love for that as well, didn't he?
He really did, and the museum is, again, I love history, and it is extremely well done at Cantini, if you want to call it Cantigny or Cantini, but it is worth a visit. It's open to the public, and people who work very hard to preserve the memory of the military people in World War I just have a high admiration for, and he certainly did his part to do that.
Well, enough of Robert McCormick. Let's move on to Orion Samuelson. Tell us when and where you were born, Orion.
Born March 31st on a dairy farm in Wisconsin near La Crosse.
What year?
1934, raging blizzard on March 31st. So much so that the doctor could not get out to the farm to deliver me, and so a great aunt was there, and she was sort of a midwife, and so she did the delivery and did it well because I survived, and here I am. But I'm born in the bedroom of the farm home where I ultimately grew up.
Orion, that's an unusual name. At least it is for me.
Well, it is. I think I've met maybe 3 other Orions. There are a lot of Orins, and I get called Orin probably 70% of the time by people who address me. My parents wanted a name that started with O and a name that started with C for my 2 grandfathers, Ole and Carl. They were Norwegians who came to this country from Norway and settled in the hills of western Wisconsin. And so when they decided to name me after Ole, they thought Orion is too common, so we'll call him Orion. Subsequently, of course, people say, well, they knew you were going to be a star, so that's the constellation. I don't think they had any idea that was going to happen.
Now, you mentioned your 2 grandfathers. Both immigrated to the United States?
Both came to this country back in the 1860s. And 1880s. As a matter of fact, I take a group of people who sign up for the tour back to Norway every other year, and in 2009 we'll do our 5th tour to Norway. And so I have stood in what is left of the foundation of the home where my grandmother Jenny was born in 1864. That was far more emotional than I thought it would be. And in 1872, when she was 8 years old, she and an older brother and an adult uncle were sent to America because times were so tough, not only in Norway, but all of Northern Europe at that time. And America was the land of opportunity, and so the parents sent their children away knowing they would never see them again, and sent them off to give them a better life. And talking to a genealogist from Norway who I've come to know during our trips, with tears in his eyes, he tells me he has read the letters from the homesick children in America to their parents, and he has read the letters that parents wrote to their children, and he always concludes those stories by saying, I hope all of you in America appreciate what your forefathers did to give you the opportunity to grow up where you've grown up.
Why Wisconsin?
As I visited Norway the first time, I saw that the hills were quite similar, not quite as high as in Norway, but hills and the streams. And as I say in Norway, the hills are steep to the point where they carve out a shelf and put up the barn in the house and then farm down the hill. And that was much of what we had on our farm. We had 200 acres and 90 of it tillable. The rest of it was up and down hills and trees and rocks and everything else.
Were they breaking virgin ground when they came here? Because I know that Wisconsin by the 1870s and later was already well populated.
Yeah, it was populated, and I don't think they were breaking virgin ground.
Okay.
And I have not been able to fully research how they acquired the land. I've seen the deed where, my father was deeded the land by his father, and who came from Norway, but how Granddad got the land, I've not really been able to research.
Okay. Tell us a little bit more about growing up on this farm. What kind of farm was it, first of all?
Okay, it was a dairy farm. We had 30 milk cows, we had 6 sows, and we had 200 chickens, and we had a dog and 13 cats. And it was my dad and mother and my sister and me. We certainly weren't wealthy, but we had food on the table and clothes on our back. And, I distinctly remember after moving into the life that I'm in now, because there's no way I could have ever imagined, what was in my future when I'm sitting on a 3-legged milking stool at 5 in the morning milking cows. And one of the things I'll never forget, we would take 2 long trips a year to La Crosse, 32 miles away. And we would go in December to do some Christmas shopping, and then we'd go in the spring to buy some clothes for the summer season. And we'd get up extra early, we'd milk the cows early, and then we'd drive to La Crosse in this old 37 Ford, and then we'd get back in time to milk cows. And I think of that often as I sit in an airplane flying to Washington, spending the day interviewing Secretary of Agriculture, senators, and congressmen, and then flying home to have dinner at home that night. And I will always be a nose to the window flyer because I'm just fascinated that I can do that in light of that twice a year 32-mile trip.
Born in 1934, you were very young at the tail end of the Depression. Do you remember the Depression?
I do not remember the Depression, but I remember the lesson that my father said over and over and over again as I was growing up. And it's too bad that we don't have some of the Depression-era people in today's economy. 2 things he always said: don't buy what you can't afford, and don't borrow what you can't pay back. And he said that over and over and over again. And when we built a new barn in 1948, he didn't buy a piece of lumber until he had the cash.
Do you remember Pearl Harbor?
I do. Yeah, I do remember it because I was 7 years old at the time. And I remember World War II very well because we would listen to the radio, to Gabriel Heater, to H.V. Kaltenborn, to Fulton Lewis Jr., and Gabriel Heater particularly would start his broadcast by saying, there's good news tonight. The Allies have a victory. Or he would begin saying, there's bad news tonight. And he'd talk about a victory for the German army, and I'd go to bed thinking they're going to be coming over the hill the next day.
So very early in your life, these names just rolled right off your tongue.
Yeah.
But, they've been emblazoned in your memory. They had a larger-in-life feel for you when you were listening to them?
They did, and we... give me a minute. We did not have electricity, and so that means that our radio was powered by B batteries. They were rationed during World War II, and so our only communication with the outside world was the radio. I would want to listen to Captain Midnight, Tom Mix, and Superman, and Dad would say, no, we can't waste the batteries on that. We have to have the news. And, of course, that news would come in the evening. And the radio was our only connection. We did not have a newspaper. And we were 1.5 miles away from the mailbox, so you couldn't, deliver any timely news or information there. So it was basically word of mouth and the radio.
Recall any times that your folks would listen to fireside chats?
I do remember briefly the fireside chats, but for some reason, and again, part of it was we couldn't use those B batteries. We had to keep them for the daily news to know what was going on. And of course, a lot of people in our community were drafted and had gone off, including an uncle and 2 or 3 cousins. And so we wanted to know what was going on and have some sense, of what they were doing. Closest movie house was about 22 miles away. And the only movies Dad wanted to see were Gene Autry and Tarzan, and those were the movies that we would go see, and that was a treat when we'd be able to do that.
You didn't get to see Betty Grable in her prime then?
I did not. No, missed that.
How about school?
School, O'Connell Grade School. It was a one-room, 8th grade country school. It had about 40 students. And you would sit in this one room and, as a first grader, do your work, but you'd hear what 2nd, 3rd, 4th, 5th, 6th, 7th, and 8th graders were learning. And so by the time I got to 6th grade, the teacher, Esther Garnett, said, you know, your test work and everything, no sense of you doing 6th grade, so we'll just promote you to 7th. And so I graduated from that one-room 8th grade country school when I was, let me see, I would have been 1940s. I would have been 13. And I was out of the one-room 8th grade country school, ready to go to Ontario High School in Ontario, Wisconsin, and there they had an enrollment of about 98. There were 23 in my graduating class, and because of that, I was salutatorian because I didn't have that much competition. And
you were making the commute every day to high school?
Yeah, school bus, except for the first 2 years when I couldn't walk, and wasn't able to attend school, and then when I got on crutches, why a neighbor boy would pick me up and I'd ride with him. So.
Well, you've alluded to something we'll get to here pretty quick. But before that happened, tell me a little bit about the chores that you had to do. What was your daily routine, especially chore-wise?
Okay, daily routine, up in the morning at about 5 o'clock and out to the barn and milk cows and generally help Dad clean the barn and then change clothes and go to school. When I got home from school, no question, I didn't have to look around for something to do because it was throw silage down from the silo and get water to the calves, the dairy calves, and clean the pens and do the work, and then we would milk the cows and generally be in out of the barn at about 8 o'clock at night, and then if there was homework, do the homework, and then off to bed. And before electricity came on the scene, we would do this by a Aladdin lamp and kerosene lantern. Why we never burned the barn down, I'll never know, carrying that open flame kerosene lantern up into the haymow. But we didn't. We had some lightning strikes on the barn, but it never burned. And so that was sort of a typical day. And then in the summertime, it was out in the field doing everything from oat harvest to hay harvest and all of, we weren't baling hay, it was loose hay that would come up onto the wagon and be taken to the haymow.
I wanted to ask you a couple more questions about going to school in a one-room schoolhouse, because kids today can't even begin to comprehend what that was like.
No.
Did you walk to school?
Walked to school.
How far was that?
It was a mile. And during World War II, when we had daylight saving time the year round, I can remember walking to school almost in the dark because I'd leave for school at 8 and the sun wouldn't come up till after 8 because of daylight saving time. And I can remember mornings when it was 35 below zero. And, we would still walk to school if we'd had a snowstorm, and we would get them. We were a mile from a main road. And we had some winters where the snow would be so heavy we'd be snowed in for 3 weeks before the plows could plow us out. So then we'd haul the cans of milk to the main road with the horses in a sleigh. And on some of those cold mornings, why they would take us, my sister and me, to school in that sleigh, pulled by the team of horses, Buster and Blackie.
That leads to another question. I'm going to get back to the education here in a bit, but apparently you had draft horses on the farm when you were growing up as well.
Yeah. I didn't like them. They didn't like me. We never got along very well. And we did have a Samson tractor, which was about as clunky a tractor as you would ever find. No power steering or anything like that. Years later, I found it was built in a plant in Janesville, Wisconsin, that later became the General Motors plant. And we had that, but it would break down, so the two horses were basically our main source of power for farming on the farm. They'd pull a hay mower and they'd pull the hay wagon, and they'd do most of the work.
Plowing?
Plowing, did that Yeah, they'd pull the plow, they'd pull the cultivator, and they really were the main source of power, because that old Samson tractor didn't have a cultivator. It would pull a plow, but that was about it.
What was the primary source of income? Was it the dairy
The milk
cattle?
check. Milk check was the 52-week source of income, but we grew tobacco. There are two areas in Wisconsin, south of Madison near Stoughton, and then up in our area, which is east of La Crosse. And we would grow a cigar-type tobacco, binder type we would call it, that would be used as the wrapping for the cigars. And the worst crop that we could ever do. I counted at one time, and each tobacco plant was handled by hand 16 times. From the time you pulled the plant out of the tobacco bed where it started, planted it, and hoed it, and all the other work that you did. And then by February, you would be in the tobacco stripping shed, where you'd strip the leaves from the stalks, put it in the bale, and then the buyers would come out, and they'd open a bale, they'd pull out a leaf of tobacco, and they'd take a lighter. And if the tobacco flared, not very good. If it didn't burn, not very good. But if you saw that red flame, not flame even, just the coal moving up the leaf, then that was the best quality. And I think the reason that a lot of those farmers did it, I know in my dad's case it was the reason, the check would come in time for the real estate tax. And so that way I remember getting checks for $500, $530 for that year-long hard work with the tobacco plant. And of course, if you got any kind of a hailstorm during the growing season, it would wipe out tobacco, because if you had holes in the leaves, and it didn't work. So.
You were growing up in a heavy dairy region. Was most of that milk used to produce cheese?
Butter and cheese. Yeah, the Cooperative creamery that we sent our milk to, they produced butter. And the milk they didn't use for butter, they would ship on to another factory that would do cheese. And then I had an uncle who had a small rural cheese factory, and so I'd love to go there and spend time in the cheese factory with him, watching the milk turn to solids, and then the curds, and then finally with the use of pressure into 40-pound cheddar blocks and that sort of thing.
Sample the wares, did you?
Oh, always, particularly the curds. They'd come flying out of that machine that would chop the cheese slabs into the curds. Yeah, ate a lot of curds.
You also mentioned you had hogs and chickens, and the number of chickens sounds like it wasn't just for your own use.
No, you'd take eggs to town, trade them for groceries, and that's basically what we did. The eggs we didn't use on the farm would be taken to town, and you'd trade them at the Johnstone's grocery store, and they'd take eggs in payment for groceries.
You butcher your own hogs?
Butchered our own hogs, and we would also butcher. We would keep one or two beef animals, and we'd butcher one a year. And in those days, we again didn't have freezers, so my mother would can the pork in mason jars under pressure. She would can the pork and can the beef, and that's how we kept it for the winter season.
Well, we can pick this thread up quite a bit later, I would think, but describe a typical hog at that time, because I suspect you had a lot more fat.
A lot more fat. Oh, absolutely, yeah. And we weren't into a breeding program at that point. Again, it was some additional cash because we'd sell the hogs at market time. And the quality at that time wasn't all that important, so you'd get a lot of fat on the meat. And the people at that time liked it. They wanted bacon with fat on it, and they wanted to be able to render it so they'd get lard. We didn't have Crisco and the other cooking oils at that time, and so the fat would be taken off, rendered, and then you'd have lard for cooking.
Did your family do the rendering and use that lard as well?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, they did. Yeah, my mother would do that.
But can you discuss how they preserved that? And now you mentioned a couple of things, but talk about that in a little bit more detail.
The lard, once you rendered the fat and it turned into lard, we'd keep that in the basement, which was a little cooler, but that was easier to keep. It was the meat that was a challenge, and that's why my mother would cook it. on the mason and put it into the mason jars. Before we got electricity, we had a water cistern on the farm that was about 30 feet deep and only about 10 feet of water in it. And so in the summertime, we'd put butter and milk and other perishables in a basket on the end of a rope, and then we'd drop that down into the cistern to keep it a little cooler than a refrigerator. When electricity came, it just literally changed everything.
Okay. I want to go back to the schools here. You're tempting me with this electricity subject,
Right.
and we will get back to that, I guarantee you. But talk about the schools and your impression of the quality of education you got in that one-room schoolhouse.
Well, I think it was very good. We dealt with the basics. I mean, you've heard reading, writing, and arithmetic, and that's pretty much what it was. I became a very good speller. I had excellent penmanship because, boy, you were taught, you do your O's and you do all of this, and had some great teachers. And geography, which is another of my favorite subjects, and history. So it would basically be history and geography, arithmetic, that in grade school was addition, subtraction, long division, and multiplication. And you'd learn the tables. If they'd say, okay, what's 4 times 9, you better know. And you were taught things that stay with you forever, at least as far as I'm concerned. The ethics that we have seen sort of disappear in the corporate world today, that was a big part of it. You do this honestly, and you do it, you can do business on a handshake, and if you shake on a business deal, that's as good as a signed contract. And you just learned what I call common sense. And you learn to, there'd be some fights, kids would get into fights and that sort of thing, but at the end, you'd always end up friends. And interestingly enough, the big fights would be John Deere versus International Farmalls. The kids with red tractors said they're better than the green tractors. Kids whose family owned Ford cars are better than Chevy cars, and those would be some of the fights that you'd get into, really, when they'd get a little tense. But you always ended up being friends, and we did a lot of cowboy and Indian playing because the school was right next to a forest with a lot of climbable trees, and you just had a lot of exercise.
What was the age spread that you had in that classroom?
Well, we had some 8th graders that were 17 and 18 years old, and we generally 1st grade was 6 years old. But we had one family that had some learning challenges, and I remember they had one boy there who graduated from 8th grade when he was 17.
Did the older kids have a big role to play in helping the young kids learn their lessons?
Only on a family basis. You didn't see it so much in school, but there were some fairly large families. Ours wasn't. There were just, my sister and me. But there were some families that would have 5, 6, 7, 8 children, and there I think the older kids worked with their siblings, their younger siblings. But as far as the rest of school, no, not a great deal. That was pretty much up to you, and you better not copy, or you'd get in trouble. If you tried to copy somebody's test paper, you would get into trouble. In those days,
that put a real burden on the teacher, though, trying to teach all those different age groups and the different levels of knowledge that she had to mold the lessons to, I would think.
Yeah, it was not an easy job, and many of the teachers went to a 2-year teaching course. They would call them, in our case it was Vernon County Normal Teaching Center, and in 2 years you'd get a teaching certificate. And that's where a lot of them came from. But I was lucky. I just had some very good teachers. And they made it interesting. And in my case, I loved school. It made me really want to learn. And I loved school. And as I say, English and spelling and history and geography. Wasn't much for geometry and that sort of area.
While you're sitting in that one-room schoolhouse, though, what did you see as your future?
Farming. I would continue. When Dad quit farming, I'd probably take over the farm. and be as good a dairy farmer as I could. And that's all you saw, because really that's where the world ended. You didn't see much beyond that. You know, you'd go to La Crosse, which I think was a town of 25,000 people, and you'd say, "Oh, it's way too crowded. I don't want to live there. Don't want to do that."
25,000, that's a huge city, huh?
Yeah, it was then. It was a huge city.
Was religion important in your family?
Yes, yeah. We belonged to the Brush Creek Lutheran Church, and that's where I was baptized and confirmed, and married in a Lutheran church in 1955. And at one point, seriously considered becoming a pastor. That was when I was 25, 24 years old. But I didn't go to college. I had not gone to college, and so if I were to become a pastor, that meant 4 years of college, 4 years of seminary, and I just didn't think that, you know, I would be able to get that done, and so I just decided to be the best layman I could be, and so I've been as active as I can be in church. And my two children were adopted through Lutheran Social Services, so that gives me a very close personal connection there to my religion. But it was interesting, because if you were Norwegian, you were Lutheran, and if you were German-Irish, you were Catholic, and never the twain shall meet. In those days, you just didn't. Oh, the one time I think I made my mother cry was when she found out I had taken a Catholic cheerleader home from a basketball game. And she had me married and raising 12 kids for the Pope. You know, it was just...
What language did they speak in your church?
The language was English, except on Christmas and Easter, the pastor was fluent in Norwegian, and so he would preach in Norwegian. And until I was 11 or 12, I prayed the Lord's Prayer in Norwegian every night, and I can still do the table prayer in Norwegian. Because you had to learn Norwegian, because when your parents and grandparents talked about things they didn't want you to know, you had to, in self-defense, learn so you knew what they were talking about. Because my grandparents spoke Norwegian 90% of the time. And so I did understand it much better than I was able to speak it. Mm-hmm. And I really can't read it at all. So, but you get to be 12 years old, and then it was not... your other kids made fun of you if you didn't speak English, so you kind of put it aside.
I wonder if the kids growing up with that had an accent, though.
Yeah, oh yeah. Oh, hey, Norwegians do have an accent, you know. We do talk this way when we have to, and when I tell Ole Lena stories, why then, yeah, Ole and Lena, when they talk to each other, that's how they talk to each other.
Tell me a little bit about the holidays. You mentioned Christmas and Easter. I was wondering if you had lutefisk and lefse.
Oh, we had lutefisk and lefse at Christmas time, and we would have ham at Easter time. And Christmas was a very special time. There was a program at the church, and I can still remember being told by my parents, "Now you talk loud enough that we can hear you." And when I was 6 years old, standing in front of that congregation, it looked like it was bigger than Yankee Stadium. And, when I've gone back to worship in that church, because it's still there, I think there were 12 rows of pews, and it really wasn't very large. But it sure looked big when you were a kid, 6 years old. We would have family gatherings. As a matter of fact, socially, having company at the house was always an exciting time. Playing cards, certain kinds of cards, because our Lutheran pastor didn't think we should dance, and there were some cards we should not play.
Well, what card games did they play?
We played Rook, and we played 500, and Euchre, and those were the cards that we could play. But if it were to go toward anything that resembled gambling, then no way.
But euchre is a lively game, is it not?
Oh, it is. Yeah, and we played on the school bus. Going in the morning and coming home at night, we'd sit and play euchre. Yeah.
Okay. we're at the point where I want to get into two very important parts of your life, and one was the illness that you alluded to, and the other one is rural electrification. And both of those are going to take a little bit of time to tell, and so we probably should explain here. We're doing these interviews and then breaking because you have a real job to do, and it was that at...
hourly market reports, but I've got another 10 minutes.
10 minutes. Okay, let's talk about getting into high school and then getting thrown a serious curveball.
I graduated from 8th grade, and that summer, was working on the farm, but I was excited about high school because, as I say, I loved school. And I was a tall kid, and so I was going to play basketball. The school wasn't big enough to have a football team, but we did have basketball and baseball, and I was excited about that, looking forward to it. But early in the summer, I started experiencing pain in my left hip, and it got worse rather quickly. And it felt like something had come out of joint. Well, my folks believed in chiropractors. And so they took me to 3 or 4 chiropractors who were all going to cure me. And it just continually got worse. And by August, they decided something else had to be done. So we drove to La Crosse, and we went to St. Francis Hospital, met Dr. Walter Jones, and he said, we'll take x-rays. And in those days, you had to wait a while. So took the x-rays, and they said, okay, you and your parents go out to eat. I had left the farm that morning, figuring I'd be back that night. And so when we came back from having dinner, which is what we call the noontime meal, Dr. Jones walked into the waiting room, and he said, I wish there was another way I could tell you this, young man, but he said, you're not going to walk for 2 years. I looked at him and said, what do you mean I'm not going to walk for 2 years? He said, you're not going to walk for 2 years. As a matter of fact, he said, you have Leggs-Perthes disease. And then he went on to explain that basically it's a decaying of the bone that goes from the thigh to the hip ball that fits into the socket. And he said, your leg is already shortening. And he said, I want to put you in the hospital right now. I'm stunned, But he said, you and your parents talk about it. And it was the only time that I saw my dad cry. So we talked about it and agreed that if he says we better get going on this, we better do it. And so I was put in the hospital that day and was there for 3 weeks with a 20-pound weight on my leg. And from there on, it was a body cast for 6 weeks, and then a wheelchair for 3 to 4 months, and then finally crutches. And it was just a terrible time. I mean, it was the worst possible thing that, I said, God, why me? And so anyway, finally got me home after 3 weeks, and they set up a bed, and I'm in this cast, no air conditioning in Wisconsin in August, pretty hot. And it was during that time that Robert Gehring, the vocational agriculture teacher at the high school, made it a point to drive out to meet all of his students, incoming freshmen, to encourage them to take agriculture courses and be an FFA member and that sort of thing. So when he pulled in, I didn't know who he was. I noticed right away he had an artificial arm. And he introduced himself, and he said, I'm here to welcome you to school. And I snapped at him and said, well, you're wasting your time. I'm not going to be in school for 2 years. And so he said, well, tell me why, and I did. So we talked, and I learned that when he was 6, he'd lost an arm in an accident, farm accident. And he was a rather mild, almost meek person sometimes. Students took advantage of him a lot when I finally got to school. But he finally said, well, he said, do you think you can study by yourself? And I said, what do you mean? And he said, can you study without students around you and do that type of work? And I said, well, I don't know, but I think so. He said, well, if you think you can, he said, I will make the 5-mile trip out from town 2 or 3 times a week. I'll bring the assignments from the other high school teachers, and I'll take your finished work in. so that you don't have to fall behind. Because that was my other concern. You know, I had real good friends who were in 8th grade, and we were going in together. And he said, that way, when you're back on your feet, why, you'll all be the same year. You won't have to graduate later and that sort of thing. So that's what happened. And he brought the assignments out, took the finished work back, teachers graded it and all that. And I'm listening to radio. I'm listening to Bert Wilson do the Chicago Cub games. And the more I listened, although I was about as bashful barefoot country boy as you'd find, the more I thought, you know, that sounds like maybe something I could do, because I knew I couldn't do the heavy farming, because the doctor said you have to be very careful because it could be reactivated if you take, you know, a severe jolt. So when I got, so Mr. Goering said, well, when you're back on your feet, we'll get you into public speaking. So my junior year, I was back in school, and got me into FFA public speaking. And by my senior year, I was good. Oh, man, I was good. And I was one of 5 regional finalists in the Wisconsin State FFA public speaking contest. And I went to that convention knowing, man, I'm going to win this for my little high school. And I came in 4th out of 5. I just got the pants beat off me. And so when it was finished, you know, I said to my teacher, I said, gee, what did we do wrong? And he said, well, let's look at it. He said, because in this case, you learn from losing. You know, you look at it and you learn. And so that is really how I got started. I look back on that whole incident, and the one thing it taught me was don't evaluate a happening when it happens. Give it some time, because what was a tragedy at the time just totally changed my entire life. Totally changed it, because had that not happened, I'd probably be milking cows today in Wisconsin and be happy. But that took that future away from me and opened a world that I could never, ever have imagined. So the one interesting footnote to the story, I talk about Mr. Goering a lot when I talk to FFA kids and young people. Again, saying, you know, don't evaluate a happening when it happens, and treat your VOAG teacher with respect, because, man, they do good work. But I said, I lost track of him. I knew where the high school basketball coach was, who let me do the PA announcing at basketball games when I got back on my feet. But I lost track of Mr. Goering, so I think it was around 98 or 99. I said to my sister, who still lives up there, I said, can you help me find him? She tracked him down, found him in Milwaukee, retired. And when she called, she said, you know, I'm Norma and my brother Orion were students when you were at Ontario High School. And he said, oh, yeah. He said, yeah. He said, I remember. He said, what's Orion doing? And I loved it. I loved it. He had no idea that I was doing what I was doing and that he'd had a difference. So I talked to him, and we had a nice conversation. But it changed my life.
And I'm sure that after all those years, you telling him your story, that had to really warm his heart.
I think it did, yeah. I hope it did, because he just played a major role. Outside of my parents, he had more influence on my life and my career than anybody I know. So.
We got a couple of minutes left here?
A couple.
You mentioned that this shook your faith, or at least it caused you to wonder about what God had in mind. A few years down the road, how were you looking at that?
I guess the way I look at it now, you know, it was a life-changing activity. As I say, it taught me never evaluate a happening when it happens. Give it some time. There's a reason for it, and in my case, it was a major reason. It scares me to think what I might have missed, had I not been able to do what I'm doing now.
This was what you were meant to do?
Well, I decided I wanted to be a radio announcer before my voice changed. So God was good to me, because he gave me, you know, you never hear yourself the way other people hear you, because I don't hear anything special about my voice, but thank God other people do. And it's the thing that's recognized more than anything else, really. if I'm in a checkout counter at a supermarket and I say something, somebody will turn around, oh my golly, you know. So he gave me a good voice. I just try to use it.
We better get you to the market report, and we'll pick this up with rural electrification.
Okay, very good.
We're in our second session with Orion Samuelson. Orion, the last we heard about was this very difficult disease that you had and how that changed your life. That was in the early part of your high school years. A couple other things that were important for you during those high school years, I would think. 1948. And in fact, you remember the specific day. Why don't you tell us a little bit?
April 11. You know, as I tell people today, there are certain dates in our life that are important. Birthdays, wedding anniversaries. But for me, an important day was April 11th, 1948. That's the day that the Rural Electric Co-op came to our farm and hooked us up to electricity. And I'm sure that this was duplicated many times over all across the country. And many times prior to when we got electricity, because they were ready to hook us up just before World War II broke out. And when the war broke out, copper was taken for the war effort, and so there was no wire available, and so we weren't able to get the farm wired for electricity, and the rural electrics, you know, were not able to do much in the way of adding new farm customers. So it took a while after the war ended before we got back to manufacturing wire and getting the farm wired, the barn and the house. And so April 11th of 1948, they hooked us up, and it literally changed our life, literally. My mother threw away these heavy flat irons that she'd used to iron. We got a refrigerator, no longer had to put perishables in the basket at the end of the rope in the cistern. I was able to stand at the foot of the stairs, flick a switch, and there was light in the upstairs bedroom. And we no longer had to milk cows by hand. We got a milking machine. We no longer had to put cans of milk into cold water to keep fresh. We now had a milk cooler that we could do that. And it just changed everything for us. And that had to be repeated time and again across America. I think the rural electric co-ops that brought power to rural America probably brought the biggest cultural change in the history of rural America, because it just so totally changed lives and made work a lot easier and a lot more enjoyable. And I suddenly had a radio that didn't have to worry about a battery going dead on you and not being able to replace it. And I liked music, and until that happened, one of my great Christmas gifts was a small box wind-up phonograph where I'd play these 78 RPM records. Now I had an electric phonograph. It just totally changed everything.
A lot of these things you're talking about, though, would have been expensive, I would think, for a family farm to deal with.
They were, but at that time, well, it's difficult to relate the difference in price today compared to them because of inflation and that sort of thing. But yes, they were not cheap. I think probably the most expensive thing we bought was the milking machine. And that was considered absolutely vital to get because milking was a tough job. And so the milking machine was really the biggest buy that we made. Refrigerator wasn't cheap, but
that was something that was purchased up front?
Yeah. The refrigerator was waiting. The milking machine wasn't, because we wanted to make sure we knew where the power outlets would be and that sort of thing. And there were cows that never did learn how to take a milking machine, and it was my job to milk those cows by hand. That's why I am the 5-time Illinois State Fair cow milking champion. I mean, these hands don't mess with them. They're very good. And so I would do the hand milking of the cows that would not take it. But then as the younger cows came online, why they were not accustomed to hand milking, and so the milking machine was readily accepted by them. But it just made a tremendous difference.
I would think the other thing that would have happened maybe about the same time was moving on from the draft animals and getting mechanization.
Actually, we got, on a May morning in 1939, a Farmall F-20 tractor.
So not too much longer after that.
No. And so we took delivery on the tractor. Again, just before the war, rubber wasn't available, so it was on steel lugs. After the war, we took those wheels off and put rubber tires on the tractor. But that was a tractor you started it by cranking. There wasn't a starter on it. And you were able to get a cultivator that would fit on it, and a hay baler and all the other things that we didn't have before. But you didn't get most of that stuff till after the war because, again, factories were making war material and not farm machinery. That tractor, Dad paid $720 cash for it in 1939. The folks sold the farm in 1964 at auction and sold the equipment and the cows and everything. The tractor at auction brought $740. So that was not a bad investment. And the tractor has been restored now, and by people in the international harvester collectors world, and so it has been restored and looks better than it did when it came off the truck in 1939 when it was delivered. But it's a tractor where as soon as my legs were long enough and strong enough, I drove, and my sister drove, and my mother and father drove, and all of us spent a good part of our working days on that tractor in one way or another, and it performed very well.
Did you say 1939 is when you got the tractor?
1939.
Okay, I heard you wrong the first time then.
Yeah, 1939, and that's the reason we couldn't get rubber tires because we were going into the war years, and so.
Looking back, though, which would you rank as the biggest impact? Mechanization, getting that tractor, or electrification?
Electrification.
Why?
Well, because it affected your entire life. The tractor mechanization was just the farming part of your life, but rural electrification was culturally and socially and agriculturally beneficial. It went far beyond just farming, which is what the tractor did. And the tractor you didn't use every day of the year, and electricity was there every day. I still think electrification is the biggest cultural change in rural America.
How about plumbing? Did you grow up with outdoor plumbing?
Oh, yeah. We had a two-holer. And as we described it, we had 4 rooms and a path. And we never did have indoor plumbing as long as I was on the farm. Never did. Dad didn't think you ought to go to the bathroom in the house. And that was just his feeling. And so we didn't.
Well, one of the things that you think about when growing up on the farm then, you got all these farm kids, you go into the one-room schoolhouse. Everybody was a farmer, I would think, in that one-room schoolhouse.
True.
How did you keep yourself clean? How did you do that? Because you're working hard.
Saturday night bath in a galvanized bathtub. And as we said, we took a bath once a week whether we needed it or not.
Where'd they heat up the water?
On the stove. They would have a boiler, and they would heat the water in the boiler, and it was a Saturday night ritual.
And what was the stove? Was it a wood-burning stove?
Wood-burning stove. As a matter of fact, Kalamazoo, Michigan is forever ingrained in my mind because that wood cook stove, on one end of it had a reservoir, and the base of the cook stove was in enamel ware, almost porcelain-like. But it was made by the Kalamazoo Stove Company in Kalamazoo, Michigan, and those letters were raised on that. And as a kid, I can remember K-A, tracing it all with my finger.
I would assume that you cut your own firewood. The family did.
It's all we burned. We didn't burn coal, and we had woods on the farm. So that'd be part of your fall work once you were done harvesting. Then you would cut trees and trim them and pull them in, and then you'd saw them. And matter of fact, there were threshing runs and there were silo filling runs where one person would own the threshing machine, one person would own the silo filler. Well, there was a person who owned the wood cutting rig, and they'd go from farm to farm. And so when you'd get probably 20 or 30 trees gathered in one place. They'd bring in the rig and would saw it up into firewood.
Saw it and split it as well?
Saw it and split it, yeah. And so that's all we had. And on the cold mornings, in the really cold days of winter, we would sleep in the front room, as we'd call it, on the floor because we had a wood heater. And so that way you'd keep it stoked all night. When it wasn't quite as cold, well, then you'd sleep in the bedroom, and by 10 o'clock at night, the fire had gone out. So in my case, I'd take my clothes to bed with me and have them under the covers, so when I got up to dress, well, at least they'd be warm.
The lifestyle you're describing here is so foreign to any of us today.
Oh, my kids and grandkids. Oh, absolutely.
How much time was there for leisure when you were growing up?
Oh, as I say, we'd probably go to a movie maybe once every 2 months. And a lot of the social life centered around the church. We'd have the ladies' aid church dinners on Sunday, and there was an organization for kids called Luther League, and we'd be involved in that. And then once you got into high school, there were basketball games, and then Ontario, Wisconsin, 527 people. On Saturday nights, the merchants would show black and white free movies in the village square and keep the stores open till 9, so the farmers would come in and do their shopping and then sit out in the square and watch the movies and that sort of thing. So you made your own entertainment.
Was 4-H or FFA a part of your life in those high school years?
Both 4-H and FFA. I credit both of them, I think, and I'm deeply involved in both of them today. I'm a member of the Board of Trustees of the National 4-H Council, and I've been very active over the years in FFA, and because they both played an important role in my life in the public speaking. 4-H public speaking, FFA public speaking, that took me away from this scared-to-death farm kid in front of 3 people to talking to millions of people today.
That was one of the questions I had from our last session. What was it about broadcasting that appealed to you? If you're you describe yourself as shy, perhaps. You certainly had a rather confining world that you were living in. Why broadcasting?
Well, I can remember being on crutches, and there were 2 or 3 kids from another family that were singers, and so they would perform for community clubs and things like that, and then they would ask me if I would maybe introduce them and do things like that, and I did and enjoyed it. And then I won a talent contest at the Viroqua Theater in Viroqua, Wisconsin, singing Scandinavian dialect songs that had been recorded by Yogi Jorgensen, and I won $10 silver when I won that contest.
How old were you then?
I was still on crutches, so I was probably 14. And that's when I think was bitten by the showbiz bug. And it was fun, and the applause was fun. And that's why today I probably do 40 or 50 speeches a year across the country, because I thoroughly enjoy it. A lot of people in the broadcasting business are not comfortable in front of a live audience. They are much more comfortable in a studio with a producer and an engineer. But I love doing the appearances, because you know right away if they like you or if they don't like you, And so that was about that time that it kind of bit me.
Okay. Going back to 4-H and FFA, could you describe very quickly the difference between the 2 organizations?
4-H was generally younger. You started in 4-H when you were 9, and you could stay in until you were 21. And it was social and cultural. I had as projects. I had a dairy calf. I had 2 registered Berkshire hogs, and then I did some poultry as 4-H projects, whereas FFA was more the educational, strictly educational. There wasn't a lot of social activity, But again, it was FFA public speaking that took me to the state finals, and where I lost badly.
Do you remember the subject?
Oh, yeah, I remember it very well. Matter of fact, an interesting story. The subject, this was 1951. And original oration, you wrote it, memorized it, and delivered it, and then 3 judges would ask questions after you had made the presentation. And my subject was, will unions work in agriculture? Which at that time was a rather controversial subject to talk about. And I think I, got probably 95, 98% of my delivery. But in the questions, there was one judge who just really hammered me on, why did I think this would work, and did this make sense, and so on and so forth.
You were arguing that unions could work in agriculture?
Yeah, that they could. And he just didn't think they could, and so we kind of went back and forth on that. About 7 years later, I'm at a meeting of livestock producers, the Equity Livestock Association, and I'm sitting next to a gentleman, and his name is Pete May, and we get acquainted, and we start talking, and the subject came up that I'd been in FFA public speaking, the state finals. He said, I judged one of those once. Well, the rest of the story is he was the judge who hammered me, and so we had a good laugh over that, because he said, you delivered it well, Orion, but he said the premise was not all that good. And I said, that's fine. I learned.
Did you have cause to change your opinion on the subject later on?
Oh, sure. Oh, yeah. Yeah. I've changed my opinion on many things over the years. That's why I don't understand the world of politics today, where you can't change your mind. If you said this 20 years ago, you can't change your mind today. I think if you're going to keep up with the times, you change your mind a good deal over the years.
Were extension services, those people helpful to you?
Yeah, there was a 4-H club agent in Vernon County, and he was very helpful. He would come out to the meetings, and then they'd hold county-wide meetings if you were in a dairy project, and they'd help you with dairy judging, because I would be a part of it. You would go to the fair, and you would be on judging teams, and you would compete with other 4-H clubs and that sort of thing. And the extension people were very good. They were like Mr. Gehring, the VOAG teacher. They were personal, and they were helpful.
Tell us a little bit about the organization, the purpose of the extension services then.
Cooperative Extension Service has been around for a long time. Goes back to when Abraham Lincoln was president and signed the Land Grant Act that established land-grant colleges and universities. And since not everybody could go to that university or to that college, they developed programs that would come to, in the rural communities, the farms. And so they called it Extension, the Cooperative Extension Service. It has broadened tremendously since that time. At that time, it was basically to help farmers and ranchers with production, education. Then 4-H, which is 103 years old, was also a part of Extension.
So it was a formal relationship between the two?
Oh, yeah. Mm-hmm. Okay. Yeah, the 4-H programs were and are conducted by people in Extension. Okay. And a lot of volunteer leaders who are involved in it. But today, Extension, there's a huge staff in Cook County, Illinois, for example. We have 4-H clubs in the city. We have senior citizens who need nutrition help, who need financial management help. We have young parents who perhaps need child care help. I've said, and I'm a strong supporter of Extension, that Extension Service as an agency probably touches the lives more directly of more people than any other agency I know. And whether it's through 4-H or whether a senior citizen nutrition program, it's hands-on. And Extension Service has struggled because of the budgetary restrictions. And back in the late 90s, when federal budget cuts affected a lot of states like Illinois, it did that to the point that Farm Bureau and some other organizations in Illinois said we have to do something about finding additional funding to replace what the federal budget has taken. And so Senator Paul Simon and I were asked to co-chair a task force to figure out how we could get more funding for extension work. And so we did. We chaired a task force for 6 months, and from that has come an organization called Extension Partners, organized in every county, that now lobbies state legislators and federal, whenever possible, to get more funding. And we were very successful back in the early part of this century. Now with the extreme budget problems for states all over, it's more challenging. But we did restore funding and get more people on staff to do the work that Extension does.
Your description of this when we began was that this is an extension of the land-grant colleges. So in the case of Illinois, it's the University of Illinois?
University of Illinois Cooperative Extension Service.
Are all the people then work directly for the university?
Work directly for the university, but salaries are kind of spread out over the county where they are, because a lot of counties have tax programs to help support extension. And so the paycheck comes from 2 or 3 different sources, but all under the guidance of the University of Illinois.
Most counties in Illinois would have an extension office then?
Yes, yes.
And those are the agents that work directly with the communities, with the students and the 4-H?
And then there are the regional or specialty people, like at the University of Illinois, you'll have somebody in animal science, and they'll be assigned a region of the state where there are cattle or hog producers, and they'll go out and conduct meetings and educational programs. And so you have the regional specialists in addition to the county personnel.
One of the people we interviewed early in this project was Doug Parrott, if you recognize
Oh, yeah,
that
I recognize the name, sure.
Yeah. And he has a love for teaching those kids how to evaluate cattle and hogs and sheep. And for Wisconsin, was it the University of Wisconsin that was the land-grant college?
University of Wisconsin, yeah. Indiana, it's Purdue, and Iowa, it's Iowa State. It's the land-grant universities.
You get close to finishing up high school, and you've already told us that your career plans had to change. What was your thoughts when you graduated from high school?
When I graduated from high school, I was in a graduating class of, I guess, 26. I was salutatorian. And as salutatorian, you received a 1-year scholarship to the University of Wisconsin. So I enrolled in the University of Wisconsin. And I wanted to take broadcasting. They weren't teaching broadcasting, they were teaching journalism. After 3 weeks at the university, living in a little room 3 stories up in a house, and being just really homesick and getting only books on journalism, I thought, this is not what I want to do. I'm not a writer. I don't want to write. I want to talk. And there was no way I was going to get that kind of an education there. So we didn't have a telephone on the farm, but we had relatives in town. So I called them and I said, I have to talk to my folks. And so if you can let them know and they can come in sometime in the next couple of days, I'll call and talk. So we did, and I said, I don't want to do this. I'm not getting what I want. Well, as I look back on that, it was probably one of the most difficult decisions that my folks had to make. My dad had a 6th grade education. My mother had 2 years of college. And so now their firstborn has a year's scholarship to the university. Hey, this is a big deal. And now he doesn't want to go. What's this all about? So they finally said, well, you take the bus home this weekend and we'll talk about it. So we did. And we, after a lengthy discussion, my dad said, well, you find a place that'll teach you to be a radio announcer and we'll let you drop out of the university. So I did. I found a school in Minneapolis called the American Institute of the Air that in 6 months taught you to be a radio announcer and taught you to write commercials and news. Also taught you how to pronounce 50 of the most difficult classical music composers' names in the world. And I did it well. I haven't said them since, but I did it well. And so I went to that school for 6 months, and before the 6 months was over, I was doing I would drive home from Minneapolis every weekend and do a program on a daytime radio station, a music program, and that station was 17 miles from the farm. So when I graduated from the broadcast school in August of '52 on a Friday, on Monday I went to work full-time at WKLJ in Sparta, Wisconsin.
Let me go back here a couple of times, and I wanted to ask you before, your medical condition and spending a few weeks in the hospital and then everything else afterwards, that long rehabilitation you had.
Right.
My guess is that your parents didn't have health insurance.
Oh, no.
That this was very difficult for them financially as well.
Yeah, it was. Now, hospital bills then weren't like they are today.
But this is also during the Second World War, was it?
This would have been after that.
Okay.
The war would have been over for 3 years, or for 2 years. And I don't really remember how they paid for it, but yeah, there was no such thing as insurance. My dad had no life insurance and no medical insurance.
Were the World War II years good years for American agriculture?
Yes, they were. Yeah, because I mean we farmed all out to feed the army. You know, that was the whole mission, and that's why people like my dad were not drafted, because he was an active farmer and he was needed on the farm to produce food. So he was listed. They had a special category. It wasn't 4F for physical, but it was an exemption for people who were food producers.
And the United States is not just feeding the American population at that time, but Europe
and feeding of course, feeding the military, and that's why when the war ended, the agricultural economy collapsed, because we had this tremendous production, and then suddenly we weren't using that much overseas, and so in the late 40s, the agricultural economy really collapsed.
Well, the reason I thought about this question at this point in the conversation was I'm wondering if your parents helped foot the bill to go to the, the American Institute of the Air.
They did, but I worked. I worked in a filling station in Minneapolis, and was able to. I think I paid half of what it cost, and I think the 6-month course was something like $1,400, and I worked every night because school would go from 7 in the morning until 2 in the afternoon, and then I'd go to work at a Shell gas station and pump gas.
Do you remember what the paycheck was at WKLJ now that you've hit the big time?
$50 a week is my pay when I started, and then they turned me loose to sell, and so I would get 10% of every commercial that I sold, and I think the price of a commercial on WKLJ, as I recall, was $4 for a minute, so I'd get 10% of that for whatever I would sell. But I was learning, and I was doing something I loved, and it was a daytime station, 17 miles from home, so I'd get up in the morning, milk cows, change clothes, go to town, be a radio announcer, and I'd get home in the evening in time to milk cows again.
Where was the station?
Sparta, Wisconsin.
Okay.
Home of Camp McCoy.
I've spent many years,
many
summers at Fort McCoy. Yeah,
Yep.
Same place. Sparta and Toma. Well, that brings us to the question of military service, and I think I know the answer here.
Yeah, I was drafted and went to Fort Snelling in Minneapolis for 3 days of physical, and at the end of 3 days they said, no, we don't want to touch this, because the doctor said any kind of a severe jolt could reactivate it, and so the military said, we don't want you to be on a medical pension from us the rest of your life, so it was 4F. I was ready to serve, but that pretty much set the tone for my life. I didn't have the uncertainty of what I was going to be doing militarily and that sort of thing, so that's what happened.
Where did you go after Sparta?
Sparta, it was on to Appleton, Wisconsin, WHBY. Spent 2 years in Sparta, and the gentleman who got me the job at Sparta was from Ontario. He was a morning radio personality and very good. Clyde Downing was his name, and then he moved to WHBY in Appleton. And about 2 months later, he called me and said, "Hey, there's an opening here for a nighttime staff announcer." So he said, "Why don't you come over and apply?" And I did. Got that job in '54.
What kind of jobs does the nighttime staff announcer have to do?
Well, the Mutual Network did part of our programming, so I do the station breaks. But then at 10:30 in the evening, I did a 90-minute disc jockey show called Music Till Midnight. Would take phone requests from high school kids and play the records that they wanted to hear, and be done at midnight, and I'd work from 6 till midnight. And then I'd go to a restaurant and help them clean up, because that paid me a little additional money. And on Friday nights, I worked at a clothing store and their formal wear department, and I probably was responsible for more ill-fitting tuxedos at weddings than anybody on the planet. But
Orion, none of this sounds like agriculture to me.
it wasn't at that point. It wasn't. But in 1956, after doing the disc jockey work at Appleton, that station was owned by the St. Norbertine Fathers, who have St. Norbert's College in De Pere. They also own WBAY Radio and Television in Green Bay.
A bigger market.
Bigger market. In 1956, that station was a pioneer in farm television. They, Monday through Friday, did a 1-hour live program in the studio with a band, and it was purely agriculture. And they had 2 farm broadcasters working there, and a third one who left, so they needed somebody to come and take that position. And the general manager who hired me at Appleton had moved on to the station in Green Bay, and he remembered I grew up on a farm. And so he called me and he said, "What do you think about working up here on the TV station and the radio station and doing agricultural programming?" I said, "Hey, it's right down my alley. Be happy to." So in '56, I moved up there, and we did 2 hours of radio in the morning, and then that hour at noon, Monday through Friday, and then a 15-minute show on television on Sunday. And we were pioneers in farm television.
All of this was strictly agricultural?
Strictly agricultural. On that show at noon, we'd drive tractors into the studio and do live commercials on the benefits of the tractor. We had 4-H kids bring in hogs and steers into the studio and show how to fit them and how to feed them and get them ready for the show ring. And we would go out to meetings with a Bell & Howell 16-millimeter silent camera, and we'd shoot film, bring it back to the station, run it through the processor, and once it was processed, then we'd do our own editing, our splicing and editing, and put it together. And when we didn't shoot movie film, we'd take black and white Polaroid camera, and we'd line up the new officers of the Dairy Association and take their picture. And we'd put it in front of a TV camera, cameras that were 5 times bigger than the cameras that we're using right now. And did that for 4 years. And just learned a tremendous amount of programming agriculture for television and radio.
It wasn't just yourself, though, that went to Green Bay, though, was it? You were married at that time?
Oh, I was married at the time, yeah. Well, actually, Appleton. Yeah, I was married when I was in Appleton in 1955.
Tell us just a little bit about that.
Well, my wife had graduated from Luther College in Decorah, Iowa, was a school teacher, and we were married in '55. That was a year after I got to Appleton.
And her name?
Her name was Nancy. And
the last name?
Peterson. Hey, Scandinavian, you know. Lutheran, no Catholic there, Lutheran. And
I was born in Decorah, by the way.
Oh, were you really?
Yeah.
Okay, great
Yeah.
Norwegian community and museum there. Yeah. So anyway, yeah. So she taught school, and I worked there. And then when I got transferred to Green Bay, we continued to live in Appleton, and she finished out the school year, and then moved to Green Bay as well.
Did you have all those extra jobs when you were in Green Bay?
No, I didn't.
Does that mean that you were getting paid a little bit better?
I was making $800 a month.
In 1956.
1956.
And put that into scale where people can comprehend today. And
in that Green Bay market today, $8,000 a year, or $8,000 a year. Today would probably pay 60, 70.
So finally you'd arrived, you're making a comfortable living.
I thought I was making a good living, and that led to an interesting exchange when I moved to WGN. But I was in the big time. As a matter of fact, I built a house. I built a 2-story, 4-bedroom house in Green Bay and rented out the house that I bought when we moved up there. And so, I was a big fish in a little pond.
I thought I heard that you mentioned a band here at Green Bay as well. That was part of the show?
Part of the show, Cousin Fuzzy and the Cousins. And, that's
like
polka
it.
country. That's polka country. And, we would do live polka shows. I mean, we had Whoopie John and Harold Luffelmacher and the Six Fat Dutchmen and Romy Gaz and the Goslings and Cousin Fuzzy and the Cousins and Lawrence Duco and the Red Raven Orchestra, Frankie Yankovic and the Yanks. We had all these big bands.
And all these names are just rolling right off your tongue here.
Oh, well, when I started in Sparta, I was a polka disc jockey, so, I know them all. And
now there's something that people would really have a hard time understanding today, I think.
Well, it was a lot of fun, and that was the one social event in Ontario, Wisconsin. We had a community hall, and Saturday night there'd be these bands that would come and play for dances. And one of the best bands we had was Les Hartman and the Iowa Cornhuskers. And later at WGN, I worked with 2 members of that band who joined us on the barn dance.
Wow.
Small world.
Okay, anything else you want to mention about your years in Green Bay? Because it sounds like those are important years for you.
They were very important years. I made my first trip to Chicago because the National Association of Farm Broadcasters, then known as the National Association of Farm Directors, I joined that in 1956. And their annual meeting would always be held at the Conrad Hilton in Chicago at the same time that the National 4-H Congress was at the Hilton and the International Livestock Show was out at the stockyards at the amphitheater. And so as a farm broadcaster, you'd come to Chicago, you'd do your business at the Farm Broadcasters Convention, but then you, as a news person, would cover the 4-H Congress, do your interviews with the 4-H kids, and you'd do your interviews at the International Livestock Show. And I would just move into the Hilton for a whole week. And I think from 1957 until 1974, I spent every Thanksgiving Day out at the International Amphitheater. It was opening day for the International Livestock Show. And so that was a very important Chicago event. And so before I came to WGN to work, I was coming down here to go to those meetings. And in Green Bay, it was the first time I had gone to Washington, D.C., and that's when I met Dwight Eisenhower, our president at the time, and Ezra Taft Benson, the Secretary of Agriculture, who later became the leader of the Mormon Church. And so, that was the beginning of a very exciting time for me.
A business trip out in Washington, D.C.
Business,
And what was the explicit purpose of that?
The purpose was the farm broadcasters would hold 2 meetings a year. They'd hold the November annual meeting in Chicago, and then they'd hold a summer meeting at various locations. And so it was a summer meeting in Washington, D.C., and we went to the White House, and we spent time with the secretary. And, what an eye-opener that was for me. I mean, hey, I'm now in the nation's capital where decisions are made, and to this day, I get excited every time I fly into D.C. It's just, I find it to be an exciting city.
When you're talking to the Secretary of Agriculture that time, are you listening or are you giving advice or recommendations?
Listening, interviewing. because at that time the big farm program was the soil bank, taking acres out of production so that we would have less production and, as a result, higher prices. So I was in awe, really. And for me, to be on the front lawn of the White House, not realizing that years later I would be a dinner guest at the White House for a salute to agriculture. It was a trip I've never forgotten.
You said that WBAY
right.
in Green Bay they were pioneers. How were they pioneers?
They were doing more television than any station in the country focused on agriculture. There were some other stations, a station in Topeka that was doing, I think, a half-hour weekly show. But when it came to doing agricultural television on a daily basis and doing the things that we did, going out, because I think before I left, we went out and did the Wisconsin State Fair on television, and that was not a cheap situation. And you just didn't find any other station that was doing that. And as a result, when we'd come to the Farm Broadcasters meeting, anybody who was in television or thinking of doing farm television, they talked to us. Bob Parker, who was the farm director, Les Sturmer, who was the number 2 man, and then myself. And by the time I came to Chicago in '60, I was the farm director because both Bob and Les had moved on to other positions. So,
I'm surprised. Is this just a local market that they're meeting there?
Yep. But it was an important dairy market, northeastern Wisconsin, with good coverage, and it was a moneymaker.
That was my next question. The thing that surprises me is you think about important agricultural areas and you say, well, Iowa would be a natural, Illinois, perhaps areas of Pennsylvania or California, and Wisconsin. You don't think as heavily agricultural as some of those other places. But it was the dairy connection, you think?
The dairy connection. Bob Parker, who was the farm director up there, and he moved to Chicago before I did and worked for Aubrey Finley Marley Hodgson, which was the advertising agency for International Harvester. And then later on in life, he worked for John Deere, and again in advertising, public relations, and that sort of thing. But he was a very persuasive person, and he just got in very well with Hayden Evans, who was the general manager of WBAY TV. And Hayden understood the importance of agriculture. And so because of that, Bob was able to get programming and time and money to do what he did. And then when it made money for the station, then that made it relatively easy. But, we had Ralston Purina, and we had the fertilizer companies and the seed companies and International Harvester and John Deere. They were all important advertisers up there. And he was able to get the wherewithal to get that done. And it was interesting, when I came to Chicago and talked to Ward Quall, president of WGN, he had the same love for agriculture. He said, we cannot look at WGN as a Chicago-only station because we're a clear channel and we have farmers and ranchers out there that depend on us. And so he had the same dedication.
Do we have enough time to go into detail about how you ended up at WGN?
Yeah, I think I can do that fairly quickly.
Okay.
Yeah. It was 1960. Wisconsin State Fair was on at the time, and when I worked at Green Bay, I listened to WGN a lot. I mean, because
they were the big footprint in the Midwest.
Oh, absolutely, yeah. Now, WLS was bigger because they were the Prairie Farmers Station, and they were bigger, but WGN just, and I guess part of it was because of the mutual broadcasting system in my days in Appleton. But when I'm out driving around, I'd listen to WGN. So the farm director, Norm Kraft, on a Friday in August, resigned on the air and walked out to become a member of the campaign staff of Senator John Kennedy for the presidency, with the thought that if John Kennedy was elected, he'd be the Secretary of Agriculture. Well, he did not leave Ward Quall very happy. As a matter of fact, Ward was angry because, the show agriculture was important.
And Ward Quall's position was?
President of WGN. And so I get a call when I'm driving back to Green Bay from the Wisconsin State Fair from Bob Parker, who had been my boss in Green Bay, saying, "Did you hear that Norm Kraft resigned today?" And I said, "No." And he said, "Well," he said, "he did." And he said, "I just want you to know that they're in a hurry to get somebody." And so I talked to Ward Quall, and I put your name in the ring. And I said, "I'm not ready for this." Well, he said, "I think you are." And he said, "Lane Beatty at the Department of Agriculture in Washington has also called Ward and put your name in the list." Well, then I didn't hear anything for 10 days. But the general manager at WBAY called me in on Monday morning, and he said, "Orion, we've been thinking about this, and, you know, if you're worth $1,000 a month to us a year from now, you're worth it right now." So he said, "I'm raising your salary." Now, he doesn't know that I know. But Bob had called him right away to say, "Look," he said, "Orion's name is in the ring," and I didn't put it there initially. Lane Beatty put it there initially. And so he wanted to take himself off the hook with his boss, who was still a good friend. So 10 days went by, nothing happened. And then I get a phone call from Bruce Dennis, who was program manager at WGN, saying, "We'd like to talk to you." So I said to my wife, I said, "You know, this isn't going to happen." I said, "We've just built this new house, and, you know, but they want to fly me down to Chicago, so it's a free trip to Chicago." I said, "But, you know, I just know that people in that market are nasty. If you make a mistake, there are 10 other people to take your place." So I came down, spent the day. Everybody I met, from Wally Phillips to Ward Quall to Bruce Dennis to everybody, couldn't be nicer. And so at the end of the day, Ward said, "We'd like to hire you." Suddenly, a day trip to Chicago has become a life-changing event. I said, "Well, I got to go back and talk to my wife." So I went back to Green Bay, and we talked, and I said, "Oh, man, I just can't make up my mind. I just don't know." So at the end of the deadline, I called Bruce, and I said, "Bruce, I just don't know." He said, "Tell you what, you and your wife come to Chicago as our guests for the weekend and take a look at housing and all that sort of thing." And we did, and came back to Green Bay. And I finally, the next day, said, "You know, this is dumb." Put my name on, put the WGN call letters on my resume, and I can go to any station in the country. So, yeah, let's do it for 5 years, get out of here, come back to Wisconsin, buy a station, spend the rest of my life at a small station. And so we took the job, and then that's when I had the conversation. I came back down, and so Ward and I are talking. And he said, "Well, Orion, what do you think you need to have to make the move?" And I said, "I have no idea." "Well," he said, "give me a number, and if you're high, I'll tell you, and if you're low, I'll tell you." And he was that kind of a person that you believed him and trusted him. So I said, "Well, how about $14,000 a year?" He later told me that he almost broke out in laughter.
You probably said that with some trepidation. Huh?
Oh, I did. You know, that was a $4,000 raise in about a month. And he said, "Well," he said, "I think we can do that, but," he said, "we'll review in 6 months, and then we'll go from there." I said, "What about a contract?" "Well," he said, "I'm from Ishpeming, and you're from the Kickapoo Valley." He said, "I'll bet a handshake works there." And I said, "It does." So we shook hands, and 24 years later, the attorneys in the Tribune Tower discovered I didn't have a contract. So the rest is history.
And with that, we probably need to break.
Okay.